Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hey.
All right. So we'll wait a couple minutes, let people drift on in. Set up here. There we go. All right. So you'll notice that I posted a video reviewing some of what we discussed last week and focused in a bit on that second chapter of Dune. Try to direct you towards some of the more, I would argue, more important points in terms of the nature of this class that you want to be attentive to, take note of, to see as you continue your reading how especially those political elements evolve, right? And those political elements in relation to the general themes we've been talking about in terms of worldviews as it relates to events of the 1960s. And in particular, as you can see, when we're talking about the 60s, the impact and the influence of competing worldviews in relation to what is termed the Cold War, right? I mean, what we're still really exploring a lot of background information at this point, building towards what I want to focus in, and we'll touch on it today, and certainly zero in on it next week, the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay? Where we really see the clash of these two ideologies, but very much influenced and impacted by the reality of both these entities having the capacity to launch nuclear weapons. Right? It really changes that level of power, destructive power. But before we get there, and it is very involved, and I have to be careful. My tendency is to keep going back and get into the whole origins of the Cold War, which would bring us all the way back to, the Russian Revolution, the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, which led to the rise of fascism and all kinds of things. So I'll try not to drift too much. I want to reassure everybody. Okay, I know that we're talking about a lot of political heady stuff, and you're not expected to absorb it all. All right, and the way that I want to really emphasize my reassurance to you is that we are going to be bringing it back to the novel. All right, and I hope you guys. I mean, how's the reading going? How's Dune? Good, interesting, fun, little. I mean, I think I mentioned last week that really once you get past those first 100 pages in your edition, 120 pages, I think you'll find that the story really starts to flow. All right, and at the beginning, yes, there's a lot of specific information that is confusing, getting a handle on the whole worldview or worldviews that are being explored in a futuristic world, right? But, again, while you're reading, be thinking of these historical events that we're discussing in class and reviewing, and the idea, as I've been emphasizing, which is really the crux in many respects of what this course is about, is the idea of the hero and power. Right? What I want to do today is go back and look at that speech that we started looking at by John F. Kennedy, and then to look at the document or the article or the essay that Frank Herbert wrote regarding hero worship. And then I want to come back and try to keep it within that hour and a half, thereabouts, to that sense of hero worship and that cult of personality, how that is viewed by what at this stage is our two key political real players, right? Not the Dune players, but the real ones, which are Kennedy and Khrushchev, right? The leaders of the two conflicting worldviews, the two most powerful entities in the world in 1960, 60, and those are that early 60s. Most powerful for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is their nuclear arsenals. And this becomes a key point. It's so transformative. We don't even, we may not even realize how much the world changed as a result of the Manhattan Project. Initially, the project that the Americans developed, the nuclear capability, the atomic bomb, the actual use of the atomic bomb against the Japanese. And then, of course, when 1949, when the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb. All right, so it's a very short period before both have it. And the political intrigue involved with that. I mean, the 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and it was quite a surprise because the intelligence at the time was convinced that they were years away from having the technology to do that. But of course, as we are discovering, and certainly exemplified in Dune, the political intrigue in terms of gathering of information through nefarious means, spying, and so on. The Soviets had spies who had infiltrated the Manhattan Project, and they had extracted information and technology that allowed them to really speed up their ability to match, and this is something we're going to discuss, which is very much a part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The perception was that they not only were matching the United States in terms of their nuclear capability, in terms of bombs, but that they were surpassing them, something that was referred to as the missile gap. And we're going to look at that in relation to, and hopefully get to it a bit today, to John Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, JFK, and how he utilized this fear, right? And remember the litany about fear in Dune, all right? Emphasize that. I will continue to do so. The use of fear as a rhetorical device, right? A type of pathos by which to persuade and to a large extent manipulate the views of the masses. Right? And I think we've talked a bit about this, this idea of fear and how it's used not just in politics, but in advertising, across the whole spectrum, this type of rhetorical device, which is we're encountering on a daily basis, and how it, in a certain sense, clouds truth, can be used to cloud truth, because it impacts the intended audience on a visceral level. And again, it's most obvious in politics, but just watch some commercials on TV. You better buy this product or else, right? And we'll see how that ties in a variety of ways, and how certainly the novel Dune, in talking about leadership, power, heroes, is very conscious of this fear factor and how it does conflict with the pursuit of truth. And truth is a very ephemeral thing, right? We don't necessarily think about it in great detail, but what is the truth? How truth for one person is contradicted and said, no, that's not true by another one, and how can we reconcile that? Especially when we're looking at intentions. What is the intent of one country's actions when they are portraying it as being one thing, when the other side has to, or is perceiving it as being aggression, when the other side say, no, it's not aggression, right? What is the truth? And of course, this is a big part of the political machinations in terms of deception. And the decision makers, the people in power, the leaders, those that are often perceived as the heroes, are left to make the decisions as to whether or not this person's being truthful or not. I used the example of Chamberlain in 1938, after meeting with Hitler, coming back and saying, peace is at hand. I've talked with him, everything's cool. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine. I believe him. My truth is that he is sincere. And of course, Chamberlain got it wrong. And it's still very much discussed today. Before I pull up the Kennedy speech again, general questions, concerns about the novel, about the politics, about the video I posted, about how you're doing. Are you overwhelmed? Talk to me. Tell me what's on your mind as we proceed, especially with the novel, because again, I'm a little concerned because I'm not spending as much time with the novel as, of course, I'm accustomed to when I'm teaching English courses. So if you're struggling with aspects of the novel, I mean, by all means, bring it up. We can address those issues. I can ally with perhaps potential fears that you may have. But at the same time, be sure you're proceeding regularly with the reading, because we're going to get to a point where we are going to plunge into the novel. Right? I'm kind of anticipating that that's going to happen once you all finish the first part.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Yes. When I was reviewing the Dune, and when it comes to the World War I, and including a lot of wars in history, I just think there is just a simple difference between personal conflict and political conflict, which have brought the wars, a lot of various wars. So, because the reason that brought conflict between personal relationship is each entity is to seek their profits. During that process, there always happen a lot of conflicts. So I found in political conflicts or any types of wars, including cross-side wars, there have been also just a desire to acquire more from beta and expand each entities, no matter it's a person or no matter it's person or no matter the nation, no matter political parties, just there was just desire and expand their power to others. So I cannot discern the difference between personal conflict and the political conflict, even if the hero will appear during the crisis in political situation. I cannot discern the good qualities in heroes normally, I think, including JFK also.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you're touching on a lot of very complex issues, not the least of which is this. The reasons for conflict in terms of the individual conflicts, which we're all quite familiar with, and political conflicts, often hinging in many respects on this idea of, and I think you were touching on this, the acquisition of resources. Right? We see a lot of conflict on both an individual and a political level that relates to need, right? We need resources. We need, on a political level, the conflicts throughout certainly in the 20th century, and this relates to Dune, the conflicts that are generated by the need for oil, a resource, right? And it doesn't necessarily that's not necessarily seemingly a personal conflict or necessarily an ideological worldview conflict. Okay, that's a need. We need oil. We don't have, I'm just using oil as an example, we don't have enough oil. We need oil from countries that have a lot of oil. So how do we get that? I mean, that's a conflict. And of course, what we're seeing is, for example, with Kennedy, who very much came in to office with the idea that to resolve those types of conflicts, diplomacy is the best approach, right? Because you have what I need. You have more than you need, right? You have an abundance of what I need. Can you give me some? And you're going to go, no, it's mine. Well, what are my options? I can say, well, let me pay you for it. Let's trade for it. I may have some things that you need and so on. That's diplomacy. Or I could say, well, I'm just going to take it because I'm bigger and I'm stronger than you, right? And that can often branch out into ideological worldviews of what might is right, so to speak. I play a game called Skyrim. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, the Elder Scrolls. It's a fascinating, I'm not a big gamer, but this is my outlet. I play it to unwind. And it's you control a character in kind of like medieval times that is put into situations often where this dilemma is presented. It may sound strange because it's a game, but the character is given choices. You play a character and you come in and you need food or whatever in this medieval setting. And you see someone who says, you know, this is what I have. And then you're given options. You can persuade them. You can buy it from them. You can intimidate them, threaten them, or you can attack them. Right? Basic, it's a game. It's a kid's game and so on. Well, when you get into it, you realize that you are I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to make the choice, which way should I approach it, as it relates to how I envision this particular character to be. And that relates to, well, obviously myself, since I'm controlling the characters. I have a number of different characters that I play with. And I have this, you know, desire, when I'm strong and I've got a, you know, big weapon, just to sit there and go, I'll just slash and kill and just take what I want. But I don't. Right? It's a reflection of my ideology. So I try to persuade and so on. And it really encapsulates, I think, what so Young, you were talking about, that conflicts on both a individual level in the pursuit of what is needed to survive versus the global political conflicts that ensue. So there are similarities, clearly. And we see this is one of the things I really enjoy about exploring these types of themes through literature, where we have characters. You know, they're not necessarily real characters, but they are individuals. So we can have the artist, the writer, explores the kinds of decision making that the individual has to make, which is similar to the type of decisions that political leaders have to make. But of course, political leaders are making them on a global scale. And the ramifications are not just how that decision is going to impact that individual, but it's how it's going to impact, in the case of what we're looking at when there's nuclear weapons involved, the world. Again, when we get to the specifics of the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably the single most dangerous 13 days in the existence of our planet, because we were that close to a nuclear war. And then the decisions that had to be made were made, for all intents and purposes, behind closed doors. We're savvy to the information that John F. Kennedy had access to, that obviously Khrushchev had access to, and their immediate advisors and so on. But at the time, nobody did, except the people in that room, especially back then as compared to now, because there was not as many apparatuses. I like apparatus. We'll go with apparatus. To, you know, gather information. You couldn't hack into someone's phone or things like that, because they didn't have cell phones, and of course, with the way things were set up. So it was very secretive. And the only understanding that the people had, and we're going to look at this, was in the speeches that the leaders, particularly John F. Kennedy, was giving. Right? He was holding during those 13 days, he was holding televised, not a press conference, but announcements. He didn't take questions, explaining what was happening. It's why I want to look at his speech, because when they get up there in front of a camera or in front of a group of people as a politician dealing with a crisis or a moment of importance in history, it's very telling, especially in retrospect, after more information is revealed, how they disseminate the information and how they are using consistently language, words that will appeal to their audience, their constituents, if you will, in relation to those basic foundational principles of the worldview of that particular society. And John F. Kennedy, notoriously was known to be extraordinarily good at this. And this will tie in with Frank Herbert's view, I would suggest, which we're going to look at today in that essay that I posted last week, of the danger of relying on that one person. And it's important to remember, and again, I know this is a bit repetitive, but I think that's okay for now to really ingrain into the way we're thinking about this, is the image that JFK projected. So that people aren't necessarily being as critical in their analysis of what he's actually saying. And if a leader knows they have that gift, they can use it to circumnavigate the truth. The other way of doing that, and we see this on the other side of the ideological divide, is you don't come out and talk about it. It's all draped in secrecy, right? And Khrushchev is really a fascinating character, because Khrushchev, and this is why the Cuban Missile Crisis is another one of its extraordinary dimensions. Leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the when he took power, mid to late 50s, Khrushchev very much embarked on a perceived approach to world politics in terms of reconciliation, right? And we will be looking at a number of speeches, because I think they're important in terms of understanding and getting to this worldviews that those particular entities had. He gave a famous speech in 1956. It was a secret speech to his own Politburo, just the inner circle, where, again, I don't want to go back too far, but we talked a bit about Stalin, right? So Stalin dies in 1953. Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union through the Second World War, and was revered as a hero. When they finally pushed the Germans out of Russia, the famous Battle of Stalingrad, etc., and then they coming from the east, while the United States and the Western allies were coming from the west, ultimately crushing the Germans and defeating Hitler and so on. And extraordinary losses for the Russians. Okay, estimated 20 to 30 million Russians died during the Second World War. Those are the estimates. And Stalin was, and this is one of the few times, because again, I would argue that we can trace the Cold War all the way back to the First World War, to the Russian Revolution, when the clear demarcation in the conflict of ideologies and worldviews manifest, right? The Marxist, Leninist, Bolshevik ideology, in contrast to the US Constitution, ideas of political rights and freedoms viewed as something, and we see this in Kennedy's speech, as something God-given and natural. Right? This goes back to the US Constitution. Marx, right, the founder of, wrote the Communist Manifesto and pretty much the founder of communism, Marx and Engels, was very much opposed to this idea, did not believe in God-given rights, natural rights. And this is, at the core, probably the most fundamental distinction between these two worldviews. again, without, this isn't, it's not a course on Marxism, and a course on Marxism would take the whole semester, and I am hardly an expert on Marxism. But at the same time, its fundamental principles are in direct conflict with the fundamental principles of the type of liberal democracy that stems from the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and everything that comes from that, and how it was interpreted. And this goes back again to Marx, which is even before the First World War, but didn't come into practice until the Russian Revolution, where Lenin pursued these principles in very much in contradiction or in against a pluralistic democracy. Right there were much more concerned with the protection of individuals against the encroachment of unfair practices that are very much related to capitalistic ideology. Right? It's a socialism. It's pure, unadulterated socialism. Equal distribution of wealth, etc. No one left behind, and so on. Now, of course, with Stalin, and as a reminder, Stalin was extraordinarily ruthless. Stalin signed an agreement with Hitler right before the start of the Second World War, 1939. The war starts on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion, the German invasion of Poland. That was only facilitated for the Germans by signing an agreement with the Russians that the Russians would not only not interfere, but would share in the spoils of that war. A very surprising and for many disturbing alliance. Up until that point, the ideologies, the conflicting ideologies between fascism and communism were obvious. Fascism was very much a dictatorial, no-holds-barred mentality of government, where communism, under the Marxist-Leninist approach, was stemming from the original Communist Manifesto, was very much opposed to fascism. Had tremendous following in the United States, right? Again, in its essence, as socialism being that we look out for each other. We run a society whereby we are all helping each other out. Take God out of the God-given rights and all this stuff. They did away with all that. No, we have control, and we have to do what's right. We can't rely on other things as they perceive them as being, fantastical and, not real. We have to rely on what's real. So when Stalin reveals a bit about how he was manipulating and bastardizing these communist principles by signing the pact with Hitler. Of course, then Hitler turned on him, right, in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, right? They signed their pact in 1939, and the war goes on, and then in 1941, Germany turns and attacks Russia, which then made Stalin and Stalinist Russia an ally with the West, with the United States and England and France and everyone else. One of the only times that there was this alliance. And the alliance was driven, and this is an important point because, again, the worldviews, the clashing worldviews, whether it's that perceived purity of communism and socialism that was supposedly part of the Russian makeup, but has already been very much torn asunder by Stalin, But all that was put aside. All those differences were put aside to fight a common enemy. Now, keep this in mind as you're reading Dune, right? And if you're a student of history, this is often the case. So you, as much as you have this conflicting worldviews and quite contentious differences, you will put them aside to fight a common enemy, in this case, Nazi Germany. And again, if we had time, we could explore how Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill were all suspicious of each other, knowing that their alliance was predicated on just this one issue, and anticipating what was going to happen after the war, especially once the tide was turned. Once the Russians started defeating the Germans after the Battle of Stalingrad, destroying the German Eighth Army, and then starting to roll everything back, while at the same time, the Western Front with Normandy, the invasion D-Day on June 6th, 44, and so they're squeezing, the war was over for all intents and purposes a year before it was declared to be over. And that's when already political maneuvering became very intense in anticipation of what's going to happen afterwards. Because many people believed, certainly in the West, that once the Nazis were defeated, they're going to have to deal with the Russians, right? These were people who said, remember, we have always, we have radically different worldviews than the Russians. So we're going to defeat the fascists. Great. But we better be anticipating having to deal with the Russians. And of course, there were other voices that said, no, no, no. Right? Comes back again to what truth do you follow and how the political information, political personalities are portrayed. Right? So you have people like General Patton, notoriously, advocating as the war was ending, send more troops because we're going to go and we should attack Russia immediately because they're decimated by their push, because the Russians, in their distrust, despite their alliance, of the Western allies, wanted Berlin. They wanted to capture Berlin to end the war. And they were fearful that the Western allies, United States, Britain, France, were going to get to Berlin from the west before they got to Berlin from the east. And so they accelerated their attacks at great cost to their army, to their strength. And there were many, such as George Patton and others, who were advocating they are vulnerable now. Now we can attack and take care of that problem, because the world cannot exist with these conflicting ideologies. That confrontation is inevitable. If we don't take them now, you are going to give them a chance to get strong, and then we'll have to deal with them later on, which in many respects was quite prophetic. Ultimately, diplomacy reigned. The United States and Britain and the Western allies did not attack Russia. And Russia then evolved into the Soviet Union. All the lands in Eastern Europe that had been taken by the Nazis, that now were liberated by the Russians, came under the Russian sphere of influence. And Russia, under Stalin, very quickly moved to consolidate their power in those regions right up to Berlin, splitting Germany, East Germany, West Germany, where we have that clearly demarcated line between East and West. The division of the world, so to speak, and at least how it was perceived in terms of the two power brokers, one controlling the West and one controlling the East. And that is very summarized and hardly detailed basic foundation of this Cold War environment, right? Coming consolidated and agreed upon pretty much universally by 1946-47.
Professor,
Yes,
I'd like to I have one point to check.
yes.
When you describe the definition of a political thing, you mentioned just solve the conflicts. And when you say political means political, using the political means is exclude the fight or violence means,
Mhm.
and just using talkative conversation without violence. When you say political approach, I want to
Diplomacy.
know. Yeah?
Yeah, so one is diplomacy, right? In its most fundamental form, you seek a diplomatic end to a conflict instead of a confrontational end to a conflict, right?
But mostly in historically, when there is political conflicts, I found that there have been lots of violence, interruption, invention, no,
And
intervention.
yes,
Yeah.
lots of violent means by which to resolve political conflicts.
Yeah, so I haven't distinguished the conflicts, solving the political conflicts without violence normally. So,
Well,
Dune
you know,
also, in the novel Dune also, there have,
well,
violence.
yeah, I mean, it's a very it's a very good point. One of the reasons I think that you're having that perception, and most of us do, is what gets the most attention, what's written about the most, are political conflicts that lead to war. The ones that, many conflicts that are resolved diplomatically, we don't hear much about, because there's not, there's no great danger. And often, and very importantly, diplomatic resolutions to conflicts on the political realm are done in secret. Negotiations in terms of resolving these types of issues are often started in any case, in secret. The other thing to keep in mind regarding your question is often diplomacy, while it's always, there and being attempted, can't really be realized until there is the threat of the conflict or the actual wars. I'll give you an example. There was an extraordinary peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt, right, at Camp David in 1978. Yes, 78. These were two countries that were at conflict. They had very different worldviews, great political, it's a whole history of it. How did they get to a point where they actually met in the United States at Camp David and signed a peace treaty? Well, it's arguable, but I'll give you briefly my take. I mean, certainly for me, it was due to the amazing courage and actions by Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt at the time. And as he openly made clear, the only reason he was in a position to enter into diplomatic relations with Israel was a result of the war of 1973, the Yom Kippur War. So it required a military confrontation, which then allowed for a political resolve that would involve and bring into play and into the fold the people who need to be persuaded that the diplomatic means is appropriate. So for Anwar Sadat, the results of the Yom Kippur War gave him an opportunity to claim a type of victory. All right, and again, not to get into the extraordinarily complex Middle East political realm, but it's an example of how the diplomacy, the talking, which can ultimately lead to certain kinds of peaceful resolutions to conflict, often happen after a military conflict. The diplomatic attempts at resolving conflict that are successful before there is actual military conflict, we don't hear that much about, because it avoided the type of conflict that gets all the news, right? We're you know, if we're going to immediately run and want to know what's going on when bombs are going off. But so much is going on in the political realm that we don't hear about. And that's the diplomacy at work. And what you're going to see in Dune, there is much of that going on. So not all political conflicts lead to physical confrontations, just like, going back to what you were saying earlier, you know, on the individual level, right? When there's conflicts, whether it's for resources or whether it's conflicting ideologies on a personal level, sometimes, yes, there are barroom brawls. And people are beating each other up. But more often, right, somebody jumps in, makes peace, a third party says, come on, everybody, calm down, and they end up shaking hands, and there is no fight. Which ones get on the news? Right? It's the barroom brawl that someone captures on their phone camera that makes the news, because it's violence and everything else. The ones that are resolved without anyone throwing a punch is not newsworthy. Okay, so I think that, you know, I hope that addresses, you know, some part of that, what you were getting at there. And that's very much in play here as we, you know, jump ahead a little bit. My point being with Stalin, and we got to get to these speeches, is because what I want to look at is when what happened with Stalin is, once he consolidated his power afterwards, his true nature was revealed. Not at the time, because Russia and the Soviet Union was extraordinarily secretive, right? There was no transparency there. So people at the time in the rest of the world really couldn't know exactly what Stalin was doing. But his purges and his domestic policies were responsible for the death of millions and millions of his own people. Millions. This all came out afterwards. And one of the reasons it came out, and as it started to come out, has a direct relationship to Khrushchev. Khrushchev started a policy called de-Stalinization. It was extraordinarily controversial in the Soviet Union at the time. Because again, Stalin had been elevated to a stature, not just of a hero, but a hero worship bordering on godlike in a political system that did not believe in God. And in many respects, Stalin replaced that. He was revered. And a lot of that was because people didn't know what he actually had been doing, because he controlled the dissemination of information. He silenced any opposition. But he still dressed it up as if he was adhering to the Marxist-Leninist idea of communism, which is very much opposed to the way that Stalin himself governed. I mean, Stalin was a brutal, extraordinarily brutal dictator, antithetical to Lenin and Marx. And that wasn't publicly revealed, even though it was known in the inner circles. How could they not know? Everyone in Stalin's inner circle had to live with the fear that at any moment Stalin was going to turn on them. He became paranoid in his later years and so on. It was a reign of terror, extraordinary terror. Where that all came out was with Khrushchev in his famous 1956 speech, which at first was a secret speech. But arguably, and this again speaks to this political intrigue, while initially it was very much secret, right? It was during a big conference, but at the end of the conference, he called for a final speech. This is in February 25th, 1956. After the conference, the regular annual conference was over, he called a secret meeting of his most inner circle, a meeting, no press, and he gave this speech, which we'll look at hopefully a little bit today, where he denounces Stalin. And it sent shockwaves and put him at risk in terms of his political power. He revealed what only the inner circle knew, but many suspected. He made it clear. Stalin was a monster. He's not the hero that we have been led to believe he is. He's not the hero that we have been worshiping for 12, 15 years, if not longer. And again, it's important to understand this in the context of this course, that Stalin was considered to be this hero. Khrushchev, who is now the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin dies in 1953. 3 years later, takes that long, before he decides to reveal, not just in the secret meeting, but shortly thereafter, the speech was leaked. And the general consensus is that was Khrushchev's plan all along, is to get this information out there, to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union's worldview to a large extent. The reasons why he did this are still debated. Some argue that he did it out of moral, ethical considerations. He knew this information, and morally and ethically, he felt obliged to let the world know. Others said it was so that he would remove this sense of fear. Again, think of Dune, fear. That Stalin had imbued in the entire governmental process, so that people in government were always just conditioned to be in a state of fear at all time because of Stalin's purges. So some people argue that Khrushchev gave this speech and exposed Stalin as a means to tell people, I'm not going to be doing that. You don't have to fear like that anymore, because that fear is preventing you from doing your job. Again, come back to the fear litany from Dune, right? Fear can utterly cripple people. Others have argued that it was, and it's probably a combination of all the above, others have argued that it was setting up the diplomatic idea of approaching and working with the United States to ease the tension between these two worldviews and these two ideologies. And there's evidence to support all these interpretations of why Khrushchev de-Stalinized the Soviet Union. For our intents and purposes, we'll be spending more time exploring if it was indeed a means by which to open up possible doors to enter into diplomatic discussions. And this goes right back to what you were talking about, So-Young, to diplomatic relations, non-aggressive, non-militaristic, with the United States. Recognizing, right, at this point, that because both the Soviet Union and the United States have nuclear weapons, nuclear arsenals, that in a bit of an ironic twist, the more nuclear weapons that are proliferated, the more they become unusable. They can only work as a deterrent because there's an understanding that if we start launching these missiles, nobody survives. I mean, we still live in a world that's similar to that, but it's obviously changed dramatically because all other countries and small entities that are becoming nuclear capable. All right, so it's an extraordinary dynamic in terms of, you know, the power structure in the world, and the fact that the two most powerful countries have these conflicting worldviews, both suspicious of the others, and both arguably looking to not just maintain their power base, but in order to ensure of national security, needing to impose their worldviews on others, or certainly stopping the others from expanding their worldviews to other countries, right? So in the certainly from the Western perspective, this is again leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam, and of course the Korea War, is we cannot let the Soviet Union expand. They've already taken over Eastern Europe, where they've put into play communist regimes, communist governments, most of them modeled on the Stalinist brand of secrecy, non-transparency, and the silencing of oppositional entities within their own circle. Not all of them, it's complex, and we don't have time to look at each one of those Russian satellite nations. But certainly, the idea was they can't expand this, and that comes to the problem of Germany. So the end result was through diplomatic negotiations, without there being militaristic confrontations, Germany was divided and made into two countries, East Germany and West Germany. Berlin itself, the city of Berlin, was a divided city between East and West Berlin. 1961, the Soviet Union built a wall through Berlin, the Berlin Wall, because so many people from the East, Soviet-controlled East Berlin, were crossing over to the West, right? Because they wanted to get away. They wanted to get away from the Soviet influence. So a wall was built to separate them, right? The famous Berlin Wall, which stood in place, you know, for like 30 plus years. Yeah. This is the dynamic, and this does speak to, and these were done without firing a shot, so to speak. I mean, there was, you know, little incursions, but without a major warning. And this was what was determined. Khrushchev comes in, he proceeds with this de-Stalinization in what seems to be, for many reasons, not again the least, which is he is reaching out. He's taking trips to the United States. Richard Nixon, then vice president to Eisenhower in 56 or 57, takes a trip to the Soviet Union. So there are these diplomatic moves in place, and the gesture on the part of Khrushchev, dressed up in this extraordinary play. It's a secret meeting, right? It's just for us. But boy, look how quickly it got out there, which did pave the way, open the door for the belief that, okay, they are changing. and maybe we can negotiate with them, because we need to negotiate with them because of the nuclear missiles we all have. We have to find some way to come together.
Professor,
Yes.
while I have been listening to your explanation, some words came to me. I will tell you. Entropy, you know entropy?
Yep.
And absolute power is absolutely corrupted.
Right.
And Renaissance and the property of power. So I remember, according to there is the difference between John F. Kennedy's worldview when in inauguration speech, John F. Kennedy mentioned the existence of God, the power of God is behind the American people,
Yeah.
and contrary to that, Soviet communism and socialism don't believe in God. I think you are trying to praise the belief in God when comparing democratic political system and socialism. And but I think just there is a obviously difference between two, but when it comes to think of the property of power, and absolute power is absolutely corrupted. So I found there's just a subtle difference between two political systems, because I think I mentioned the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
Renaissance has come after middle-aged belief in God. So the power of the Pope has been scattered to the little church, I think, like that. I think there is a similarity, because so in democratic system, there is just a temporary less obvious corrupt power. And
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and it's again, it's a very astute observation. Is despite these, and this is one of the things we're going to be exploring in both Dune and in what we're looking at, despite their ideological differences, right? So communism, Marxism, Marx himself coming out saying, no, we don't believe in God-given rights, right? In essence, saying we don't believe in God. Yeah, okay, what does that mean? Right, in terms of, does that mean that all the people under communist rule or socialist rule don't believe in God? On the contrary, right? The religious, the belief in religion and God always was maintained and prevailed throughout the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, there was an explosion of basically underground religious societies which could now come out in the open. I mean, this is a different discussion in terms of what is idealistically sought after and what is reality.
I'd like to just talk about using the existence of God in John F. Kennedy's inauguration speech. And the Soviet leader also used the existence of God in political. They just used the non-existence of God to manipulate people, not to believe in God.
Well, yeah, I mean, to a set, I mean, certainly, and I'll put it up in just a minute. We'll look at the John F. Kennedy with the references to God, and even up to today, we constantly Western politicians refer to God. I don't know if necessarily the communist, Bolshevik, socialist rejection of God-given rights is purposely used as a political tool in terms of using atheism, if you will, as a political tool. I think certainly where it comes from, which is Marx and Engels out of the Communist Manifesto and Lenin and his Bolshevik Party, is very much rooted in a strong belief that a reliance on the idea of God-given rights is detrimental to achieving a social justice world. So I don't think I think they followed that on principle, not as a political weapon. I think it came to be used as a political weapon. Certainly Stalin used everything he could as political weapons, and it's still used very much today as a political weapon, as a means to consolidate power, especially if it's being used in a aggressive way against governments that are overtly adherent to religious principles, which we have many of, right? Theocracies and so on. But the core conflict between God-given rights and no, there are no God-given rights. I really believe, because you trace that back to the earliest documents that proclaim that, going back to the United States and the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and going back to the Communist Manifesto, when were used on very much moral and ethical grounds. For the Communist Manifesto, the ethical grounds was this will distract you and deter you from following through and creating a just society. Basically, the attitude was you have to stop believing in these superstitions. They are holding you back. But of course, as with so much of the Communist Manifesto, the basic core of communism, so much of it has been twisted, right, for political gain and political power, as has so much of the US Constitution been twisted in many ways for political gain and political power. So that, I think, speaks as well to your idea that it all ultimately does come down to a power struggle. The need to utilize whatever means necessary to achieve the kind of political power that then will allow you to take the necessary actions to create a society that conforms to the worldview that you adhere to. And the path to getting there, and we're going to see this in Dune, and we see it in our world today, the path to getting there means a lot of horrible things are going to have to transpire. And then the ability of the political leaderships to rationalize and justify them by looking long-term to the end game, the final goal, which is that worldview, ideological society that they want to maintain or achieve. I mean, we could look at this as well, but that's, again, a whole nother thing. But happening at the same time, of course, is the Chinese Communist Revolution. That was happening right around the same time this was happening, which is, ideally we should be talking about, because it had a huge impact. It was another communist regime, of course, allied initially with the Soviet Union, but they had major differences, which are manifest today, even though they are both adherents to, trace it all the way back to the initial precepts of communism. But they have formed those basic ideas, molded those ideas to conform with the realities in which they exist in order to A, gain power, and then maintain power, which usually renders the foundation of that ideology unrecognizable. And it's justified and rationalized because, and there's some legitimacy to this, because it needs to evolve with the changing times. Right? You know, over the course of 100 years, the world changes dramatically. I go back to my example, I think I gave this example last week, to the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the right to bear arms, right? So in the United States, this is a contentious issue, has been for many years. It's written into the Constitution that every American has the right to carry a gun. Well, at the time that that was written, it was a very, very different world than it is today. So the argument of saying, you know, we should change that is extraordinarily logical on one side. Traditionalists are saying, no, we can't start changing the Constitution because if we do so, then we can change everything. Right? Politics is a messy, messy business. But what we're looking to see is how it always comes back to competing world visions, even competing world visions within a specific political entity where we have divisions and controversy. You know, certainly in our democracies, we have competing parties. So we have our elections, we have debates. They can get quite contentious. We just saw that down south. God knows we've seen it up here in Canada. All right, and that is part of our process. That is one way to move forward with your worldview. Politically, liberal democracy encourages debate. Political rights for the individual. It's very much predicated on individual rights as well as some form of social rights. But the emphasis is on the individual. Whereas when we get, yes.
Yes, you mentioned the long-term end game, and people have been waiting for ideological society at the end. And as you know, there have been lots of revolution and reformation by the government or by the people, but in reality, it's different. It's different from fairy tales, right? The end of the fairy tale ends with happily live happily ever after, forever. So, but in reality, it's a different thing.
This is probably, you know, the most important point, right? Yes, if your end game is this, we talked about this last week, right, is a utopian vision. I think I used the example that, you know, the end game is the world I want is where there's no war, there's no hunger, there's no conflict. We're all going to sit around a campfire on the beach, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya. No one gets my Kumbaya reference, do they? I'll play it for you when we get into the culture of the 1960s and the whole music scene and the hippie movement, which is what that segment of the population took into their own hands when they were acknowledging that the government is not going to get us there. The government is too corrupt. This led to a cultural revolution in the 1960s, not just in the United States, but throughout many places in the world, where it lent itself more to the United States because of its emphasis on individuality and individualism, where communes sprang up, where they said, we'll just create this utopian world ourselves. didn't really work out, but they had their moments. There was a few years, 1964 to 1968, 69. I mentioned to you the Deadheads and this whole, cultural way of trying to achieve that utopian vision. But ultimately, yes, this is one of the problems. Okay, this is delicate. You mentioned it's like a fairy tale, right? This was one of the reasons why the Marxist, right, idea was trying to move away from God-given right, because one of his concerns with religion is most religions all advocate for an end game of a utopian world. And yes, Marx said that's a fairy tale. That cannot happen. He changed that into what his utopian vision would be, which was much more pragmatic. It was rooted in what can and cannot be done in terms of economics, right? In terms of political realities. He still, and this is important, it's still ultimately geared towards a changed utopian vision, but an ultimate, this is where we eventually want to be. But I think always with an understanding that we will never get to there, so let's make it something that is feasible. Of course, the problem with anything that approaches that is the propensity for human nature to always want more. Right? So this is why, for all intents and purposes, communism has struggled, to say the least. And certainly the Soviet Union no longer exists. The communist regime of the Soviet Union was ultimately dismantled. And a lot of the arguments, a lot of the theories regarding that pertain to the idea that it did not take into account or make contingency plans for this basic human need and desire to always be moving forward. All right, which is of course something that's exploited on the other worldview of capitalism and this liberal democracy, where we grow up in the West with a basic attitude: you can be anything you want, you can do anything you want. Right? We see usually people who have achieved great success telling people that if I can do it, you can do it, which of course is extraordinarily simplistic. But at the same time, that worldview that we have here in the West does advocate for that. Always wants to keep that. That's what capitalism allows for as well, to keep that possibility open. That, you could be the next LeBron James. You could be the next Taylor Swift. You could be the next president of the United States. That is an ideology and a worldview that is entrenched in this Western worldview. Certainly in this liberal democracy idea that stems from the American system. And that is, we see it in, let's get it up before we run out of time, in JFK's speech. But of course, it is flavored in a manner that needs to appeal to a broad spectrum of people. Right? The idea of uniting. We see that today as a result of the previous election and the 4 years of Trump and so on, where there's this call for unity within. So that union, it's a real struggle in the United States right now. There's never been, at least to my recollection, such a lack of unity in the United States, and maybe that was inevitable. But we certainly see with Kennedy in his speech, and certainly with the basic tenets and ideologies surrounding the American system, the American worldview, this idea of we reach it to everyone, and everyone has equal opportunity to succeed. But it is predicated on success. We see in the speech how Kennedy tries to temper that a little bit, right? The famous line, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? Playing on this idea of giving back, which is actually riffing off of basic theological Christian doctrines, which again, we will be talking about because we, as I mentioned before, this idea of separation of church and state is a bit deceiving. And again, something else that Dune very much explores. All right, time flies. Time goes too fast. Let's get this speech up and take a look at it. So I'll go through this quickly because we're already at 10:22. I mean, again, and I think we're okay doing this for now. It's laying a foundation. I know it's a lot of information, and some of it is repetitive. But that's okay because then you should be absorbing it more. Be prepared because I'm going to go a little quicker now because I want to get to a couple things before we wrap up. For next week, again, continue your reading. Make sure you're on track to finish part 1 by the due date that it's meant to be done. Next week, the plan is to very much get into the specifics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want to get into that to really lay this foundation for the political dimension of these competing worldviews. And then that will allow us to branch out and get into what I think will be a little more fun in terms of the cultural revolution of the 60s and how that really transformed the worldviews, mainly by instilling these types of divisions in the American system, the counterculture. And we're going to look at this in the next 2-3 weeks in terms of the music, the art of the time, and certainly the whole hippie movement and things like that. And I think that'll be a little less daunting than all this politics we're doing now. But this lays a foundation. Then we will circle back to the political as we continue our journey from 1960 up to as close to the present as we can. See how that goes. So again, I'm just going to read the opening because it's quite telling. We observed, I know we did this last week, but I just want to touch on it again, especially after our discussion that we just had. We observed today not a victory of party, but a celebration, and I'm going to, again, point out these words that we've been looking at. Celebration of freedom, the emphasis on freedom in the American system, the American worldview, and how that idea of freedom is often used very specifically to criticize a Soviet or communist or even socialist worldview, that it curtails your freedom. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God, the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. So this idea of freedom is very much attached to God. And remember, we talked about heroes, authority figures in a religious, theological perspective. No one is the greater authority than God. And then he's just laying, again, what the forebearers, right? The forefathers, the writers of the American Constitution. But the world is very different now, right? We've talked about this, and Kennedy is acknowledging it. For man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. So one of the things to be attentive to any of these political speeches, and I will be posting more over the course of the week in anticipation of what we're going to be discussing next week, the embellishments, the rhetoric that is part and parcel of politics and political speak. Okay. For man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty. Well, then why haven't they done it? Right? It's conjecture, but very appealing. Right? It is not just to say that we have an issue regarding poverty. It's to say, look how powerful we are. We actually could do this. It's a challenge. We have the ability to ending all forms of human poverty. Let's get at it. But notice how he marries it to and all forms of human life. We can abolish poverty, but we can also abolish life. So that is signaling the nature of this speech in relation to this Cold War dilemma. Are still an issue around the globe, the belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. So here, right, and this is important, here is really the crux of the conflict between East and West. The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state. Well, in the Soviet Union, the rights of man come from the generosity of the state. The state runs it. The state determines how to make everything equal. In contrast to the hand of God. So it's almost a direct shout out to Khrushchev and the Soviets. Right? Almost verging on a taunting tactic. We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution, right? Again, remember his audience, his specific audience here is first and foremost the American people. It's an inauguration address, but of course he knows the world is listening. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. This speaks again to the image he is projecting. It's a new generation. He's a young president. The previous president was Eisenhower. Everyone knew Eisenhower from the Second World War. And Eisenhower, when he finished, must have been well into his 60s. Kennedy, I believe, was 42. Young, handsome, dynamic, charismatic. Born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today and at home around the world. So again, we are not going to allow any of this to be taken away from us. Very much rooted in the idea of the ongoing conflict. It's very specific here because of the situation of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States and nuclear capabilities. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, he's continuing it, that we shall pay any price, any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty, freedom, back to individuality. This much we pledge and more. All right. Again, I'm highlighting this part, which I did last week as well. So now it's doubly emphasized. So you should take that as a clear indication of the possibility that somewhere over the course of the next 10, 12 weeks or so, in some form of an assignment or midterm or final exam, something might reference this opening part of JFK's inaugural address. Is that clear enough? Know this stuff. It's important. Okay? Right? This is posted on Omnivox. Now, I will be coming back to this speech regularly. I just want to highlight one other part of it for now, because I do want to get to the other document before we wrap up, and we're already at 10:30. But do remember, because of the emphasis I've been placing on this concept of fear. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness. And sincerity is always subject to proof. And here, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. That concept of fear. And then finally with this, because I mentioned it a couple times, but just to show that it's actually here, the most famous line from this speech. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Right. I'll be coming back to that, but that would be something, that's what he's most known for from this speech. And we have to think about that. And I don't want to get into it now, but I want you to think about that, how that ties in with other things that he's saying here and what we've been discussing in terms of the basic elements and ideas of his worldview. Okay. So we're going to wrap it up here. I think someone put some. Yeah, this is not a page in the book. This is a document that I posted. Okay. And then I just want us to quickly, I promise quickly, if I can find it. What is it? Hold on. Bear with me. Oh, that's why. Okay. All right. Okay, because it was in a PDF and not technology. All right. So just to draw you, have you had a chance to read this yet? Dune Genesis by Frank Herbert. Okay, you should. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Obviously, I just want to talk very briefly about this before we finish up. Do read this for next week, please. Okay, and try to. I know that the Dune in itself is a lot of reading. I will post some other documents this week. Get to them if you can, but please read this. Right, it's posted on Omnivox. right? Because this is the author of Dune. This is the man. And he was very clear in terms of the genesis, right? He's talking about how he came to one of the, what was a driving force for him writing the book, one of them. And what I do want to draw your attention to now, and then you read it yourself, how did it evolve? I conceived of a long novel, the whole trilogy, one book about the messianic convulsions that periodically overtake us. Be attentive to these words. If you're not familiar with them, write them down. We'll talk about them next week. I think we'll be able to fit it in while we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Demagogues, fanatics, con game artists, the innocent and the not so innocent bystanders were all were to have a part in the drama. And here it comes. This grows from my theory that superheroes are disastrous for humankind. Click, 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 click. Right now, again, we see we're always bringing it back to Dune. Even if we find a real hero, whatever or whoever that may be, eventually fallible mortals take over the power structure that always comes into being around such a leader. And personal observations convince me that in the power area of politics, economics, and in their logical consequence, war, people tend to give over every decision-making capacity to any leader who can wrap himself in the myth fabric of the society. Hitler did it, Churchill did it, Franklin Roosevelt did it, Stalin did it, Mussolini did it, but now watch what he does here. My favorite examples are John F. Kennedy and George Patton. We're certainly familiar with Kennedy, and I mentioned Patton briefly earlier. Both fitted themselves into that flamboyant Camelot pattern, consciously assuming bigger than life appearance. But the most casual observations reveals that neither was bigger than life, and each had our common human ailment of clay feet. Okay, so read the rest of this on your own. We'll talk more about it tomorrow, but I came to it here at the end, and now maybe you can, I see, I think, maybe, oh boy, but this is the process, bringing this all together between the two worlds, the world of Dune and the world of our recent history. Okay. All right. Questions? Next week, as I said, the idea will be I am going to show you, and if you have a chance, I'm going to be posting a Khrushchev speech, the one I referenced, the secret speech where he attacked Stalin. There's another dimension to that speech that I purposely did not bring up because I want to discuss it with you next week. It's a preamble to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but do try it. If you don't have a chance to read it, I get it. I will go over that speech with you next week as well. But I'm going to post it in the next day or two so you have a chance to look at it. And look at not just his attacks on Stalin, but look more closely as to why he is starting this de-Stalinization process. What is his particular criticism of Stalin? And think about that in terms of the Frank Herbert essay about the dangers of the hero. Okay? We're good? All right, guys. That's it. Again, I'll be posting another video this week. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm not even sure exactly what the focus is going to be because I got to see what we can cover, what we can't. I'm going to remind you one last time today. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed here, okay, that the water is rising. Okay? Hang on. Write down your questions. All right? Again, I'm in a difficult situation right now. I have 3 cameras on, and I don't have the cameras on for any of the rest of you, so I can't read your faces. But I'm going out on a limb saying that some of them during this last class have been a little like, what? Okay, we're going to tie it together. But bring your questions. Write them down, even if you don't bring them up in class. Write them down and see if they don't get answered as we proceed. Okay, and those of you who are asking questions, and I encourage all of you to, keep them coming. Okay, because it's important. It helps direct me and to address more specific things, because we're dealing with a huge subject at this point that I'm trying to bring in over the next couple of weeks to get it really tight so that we can really look at the connections with Dune. So if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed, hang in there and understand that I know, and I'm not going to be giving you assignments or testing you, expecting you to be able to have a deep understanding of the origins of the Cold War. Okay? Don't worry. That's not what I'm expecting. All right? And I'll be very clear with what my expectations are when we get closer to the midterm and whatever assignments are coming up. And I will look over, I haven't had a chance yet, I will look over your heroes, all right? Again, very apropos for next week. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right? Good.
Thank you so much, sir.
We'll see you.
Thank
We'll
you,
see
sir.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
I'll have my camera off. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a ask for you. Favor of you.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you. May
Yes.
I?
Yes.
I am very interested in your assignment about hero,
Okay.
and my colleagues would have submitted you, and I am interested in individuals' interest. So if it is possible, if other colleagues would allow to share their heroes together, I'd like to see and read their heroes essay also.
Okay. So you're anticipating me. We're like-minded in our thinking. The purpose of me giving that assignment is to, I don't know if we'll do it next week, but in the near future, is to have everyone share. And the reason I want to do that in the next week or two, again, I don't think we'll be able to do it next week. It'll probably be the week after. The reason I want to do that is at the end of the course, right? If we look at what you guys all wrote for this assignment, what is a hero? What are the qualities of a hero? Give me an example of 3 of your heroes. That's what you've all written. I want us all to look at those together. I'm not going to force people to share if they don't want to share, but I'm going to encourage everyone to share. And then in 8 or 9 weeks, I'm going to ask again if that's changed. Have you changed your understanding and idea of the hero? And are there other people that you would now like to perhaps put on that list of heroes? Okay.
Oh yes, I'm very happy.
Yeah. No.
Thank
So we're thinking the same way. So that's good. Excellent. Excellent. All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. We'll see you next week.
Next week.
Bye now. David, are you there waiting for me or? I'm going to take